Mark Carney with the big win. Jean Chrétien speaks at the leadership event. Trudeau wants radical reform of the RCMP. China adds tariffs in response to the Canadian tariffs. BC Conservatives lose 3 MLAs. And the colonial rental market sees incentives as vacancy rate climbs. All that and more on The Really Big Show. I'm Jim Check with Kelowna Now. On the line with me, Ian Burns, our managing editor in Ottawa. Look at the background in Kelowna. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful day here as we approach spring. How's it looking in Ottawa?
Not as beautiful as that, but it's quite nice actually. It's sort of a bit of sunshine mixed in with clouds, and it's not freezing temperatures, so could be worse.
Not freezing. There's a win, right?
Yeah.
As expected, Mark Carney with the win, right?
Yeah, I mean nobody's surprised, really, are they? I found it. The whole thing was a little bit ridiculous, really, wasn't it? When there was like the drum roll, and it was like, I mean, come on, we all know who's won, for God's sake, just
he
get
was
it over with.
sitting on the edge of his seat there, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's almost to the point where it must have been a little bit embarrassing for him, even, because he was having to go along with this stupid, like, ruse, this ridiculous farce that it was a contest, you know? And think about people like Chrystia Freeland as well. She had to sit there, like, with a massive fake smile when she knew that there was no point in her being there. But I don't know. It's a funny one. One thing that is for sure is they've made their mind up. The Liberal Party, at least the people who actually are committed enough to sign up and vote, they really are pretty certain that Mark Carney's their guy.
Yeah, so they had bragged about getting 400,000 Liberals signed up, and then it was almost anybody could get in because you didn't have to pay for membership to actually sign up. So there was a lot of signups. And then after that, they tightened up the rules and ended up with only about 151,631 valid votes after that. So that's a lot further down. And there's a lot of tweets out there saying, how did Canada elect another Liberal? I mean, it wasn't an election. It was a Liberal Party leadership election. It wasn't a Canadian general election.
Yeah, and it was quite. I read the CBC and listen to the CBC on the radio for my sins. That's my punishment in this life. But they've kept referring to this as like an even more comprehensive and bigger victory than achieved by Pierre Poilievre in 2022, which is true. But something that they didn't mention on the CBC, I don't know why. Maybe you could tell me. I'm far too naive to know these things. But what they didn't add was that in the Conservative race, there are about 450,000 people that voted. So about, the Liberal leadership election had about a third of the votes, a third of the people involved in voting.
And there's another way to look at this too. Instead of like saying that, Mark Carney was clearly the standout candidate, the other ones may have been just that weak, right? That, like the 10 years of that group, right? I mean, Karina Gould, I mean, you couldn't consider a serious candidate. And Frank Baylis, I think, likely could have been one of the strongest candidates, but nobody knew him and he didn't get any airtime really.
Yeah, I actually think he was a pretty serious candidate. I mean, it's he was just not favored in any way, was he? And yeah, he had no like name recognition even within the Liberal Party, I think.
Yeah.
But he attempted to be serious anyway. Whereas Karina Gould, I mean, I don't think I got the impression right from the beginning that she didn't think she was going to win. It was just she was just trialing out for a bigger cabinet position in the government of Mark Carney, I think, and maybe hopes to lead the party in about 10 years or something like that.
Yeah, so Carney's the first person since John Turner in 1984 to become prime minister without holding a seat in the House of Commons. That's again that he doesn't actually hold a seat, so he can't sit until he wins a seat. So there's a lot of talk that we'll talk about it later that there will be an election coming right away. And they did strengthen all the rules and then threaten people with a $10,000 fine. I don't know how they would ever administer that $10,000 fine if you weren't a real Liberal and you voted. So I don't know how you could tell who's a real Liberal and who's not a real Liberal. But according to a lot of the outlets right now, they're saying Mark Carney is going to call an election very, very soon.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few sort of prominent people who are in the sort of political bubble in Ottawa who think that he might actually also hold on for a while and try and get that kind of, I don't know, some of the prestige, let's say, associated with being the prime minister, and just try and milk that for a little bit, and maybe do a couple of things almost certainly related to Donald Trump, and maybe try and get a couple of things passed, because Jagmeet Singh has already said that he's up for that.
Right.
He will connive in the passing of bills related to
I,
the Trump tariffs.
I think Jagmeet is worried about his job because I think once the election gets called, Jagmeet may be losing his seat. It does not look good for Jagmeet Singh and his support of Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, but then Mark Carney also supported Justin Trudeau, so it doesn't seem to be damaging his reputation. But
Justin
we'll
Trudeau
have to
had his
see. But yeah, it's like maybe a few weeks. Maybe he'll give it a few weeks just so that he can kind of make a noise and have something to hold on to, and then say, "All right, I've done this, passed this really, whatever he would say, this very smart bill related to the tariffs," and then he'd say, "Now let's go and have an election." And
well. I think
that would make sense to me, because then, but there's also there's also the point of like, is he going to have to go through the awkwardness of like sitting in the gallery in the House of Commons because he hasn't got a seat, because that would look pretty weird. And like, who would actually speak for the government? I mean, there are in the Commons. I mean, there are questions like that. But if he's confident that he's going to survive in the House because of Jagmeet Singh again teaming up with the Liberals, then that does give him a chance, I think, and maybe they would be unwise not to seize that chance.
yeah, I think that the longer they delay it, the more angry Canadians get. And I think they're in their honeymoon phase right now, and I think that's why I believe the election will get called sooner than later. Um, and I think like the
I
question.
did think that, but the Canadian people seem, so far, at least according to the pollsters, they seem to have rewarded the Liberal Party for proroguing Parliament, for, in a severe crisis moment, choosing to argue among themselves and have a drawn-out leadership competition that lasted 2 months. I mean, all of that seems to have actually been looked upon by the Canadian people with great favour. So, I mean, I thought that originally as well, but I think I've sort of had to change my perspective on that, because it really does look like they've not only got away with it, but actually been rewarded for it. So they might also have expected to be punished for that, but now they're thinking like, wow, like they like this, so let's just keep it going.
The Pierre Poilievre held a Canada First rally on the same night, and even CBC admitted that Pierre Poilievre had more people at his rally than the Liberals had at their leadership event.
Yeah, well, there does seem to be a lot more kind of, should we call it, grassroots energy, grassroots support for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. I mean, that would also be borne out by what I said earlier about, 3 times as many people voted in the Conservative leadership election. And the Conservative leadership election didn't have any particular like big hitters in it either. It was Charest came second, didn't he? And like Patrick Brown was in it. They were hardly like inspiring candidates. It was hardly like a major duel between two giants, was it? But they still
Jean,
attracted more. So it seems like and I think that's probably as well to be expected, isn't it? Because the Liberals have been in power for 10 years. Like, I think the enthusiasm is running a little bit dry at this point.
Jean Charest, yeah, he tried out to be the Conservative leader, and now he goes and works for the Liberals, I think, doesn't he? He's on every panel and board, and he's there a lot for sure. I guess
Well, he was considered one of the potential candidates for the 2013 Liberal leadership, wasn't he? Because he
Yeah.
hadn't declared himself to be a federal Tory at that point, I don't think. So he was like, there was a lot of speculation that he would run against Trudeau, but obviously didn't, and then ended up 10 years later joining the Conservative Party. But that's kind of that was what won it for Pierre Poilievre, wasn't it? He kind of branded him as a liberal, and I think that stuck.
And they brought out the big gun last night. They brought out Jean Chrétien, and he's calling for boosting an energy tax on the Americans to fight off tariffs. We had Jean Chrétien here speak at the 2019 Level Up conference along with Stephen Harper. And a lot of the speech that Jean Chrétien made last night, I was just like, holy cow, that's the same speech he made in 2019 at the Level Up conference.
Yeah. Well, you know, he is nearly 90, isn't he? He's fair age.
Just,
Maybe he's
he just has
he
that one
hasn't got
speech.
the hard drive space.
He just has that. And he was what I would call my political, if I were to say one person that I really respected is Jean Chrétien for a lot of things that he did. Last night, though, he kind of gaslit Canadians a little bit with, like that, he did some bragging points was just manipulation of stats, right? Highest GDP per capita, or not, highest GDP debt per capita or something. What was that number he's playing around with there?
Yeah, it's debt to GDP. It's like, because obviously a lot of if you look at European countries and Japan, for example, they're just like indebted to the hilt. I think Japan's like 300% of GDP or something. It's like the Japanese debt situation is just like unfathomable, really. And then there's similar in Europe and places like that. And places like Italy. Sorry, I was going to say, and Greece. Famously, but Canada has a slightly better debt to GDP ratio, but it's not really about that, is it? Like we've discussed this many times. It's a bit of a misleading statistic, that, because that just means you have a little bit of, theoretically anyway, a little bit of sort of fiscal headroom. These are like pretty abstract concepts. I don't think a lot of people actually even really know what this means, and there's a reason for that, because it is quite obscure. What matters is, are you rich or are you poor? Like, is the country thriving? Is it flourishing, or is it declining? And I think the statistics you need to look to for that are GDP per capita. I mean, that's one of the main ones anyway. And the GDP per capita has been, very, very bad. It's been tragic in Canada for the last several years.
And
So
there's a huge divergence between U.S. GDP per capita and Canadian GDP per capita. That graph has been all over the internet. We've showed it many times as well. It's not good for sure. But Jean Chrétien really pushing on tariffs on energy or taxes, and then he said, "We'll use that money to build infrastructure that is needed in Canada to build a pipeline for LNG from Alberta to Quebec." And he said, "If we do that, we'll keep our steel workers working in Canada for a long time." Again, he's promoting a LNG pipeline. Not sure if Quebec is into that and or the rest of the Liberal Party. Be interesting to see too
yeah,
well, we'll talk about it in a second. We'll go on from there. But the Port of Vancouver reaches record cargo levels as crude oil exports soar, though. So again, energy is our biggest contributor to our GDP. And if we had pipelines like the Northern Gateway and the East-West Pipeline, just think what Canada could be doing.
yeah. Well, I mean, this is like, you think this is going to be shouted from the rooftops by the Liberal Party, because they lost a bit of support over this by pushing for this to, well, first to be purchased by the federal government, but then also to be pushed through. And there was so much opposition. John Horgan in BC absolutely hated it, didn't he? The NDP was so reluctant to let this happen, and many other sort of activist groups and whatnot. There was a hell of a lot of opposition, but it's like, you'd think that they would brag about this as one of their great achievements, but they're obviously a little bit shy about doing that because they don't want to alienate the green activists. So it's a weird one. But I mean, what's it, like 500? I can't remember the exact percentage. 527%, I think it was, oil increase in oil exports. I mean, that is massive, isn't it? That's a profound increase.
We got a little clip from Mark Carney's win last night. Just a small clip here.
Would let our planet burn. This is not leadership. It's ideology. It's ideology that betrays what we as Canadians value, each other. It's an ideology that also represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how the economy works. Now, unlike Pierre Poilievre, I've actually worked in the private sector. I know how the world works, and I know how it can be made to work better for all of us. And that knowledge is especially useful now in the service of Canadians when we must build a new economy and create new trading relationships.
There you go. He says Pierre Poilievre would let the planet burn. I guess that's in reference to the climate change policies, and that's clearly on Mark Carney's platform. And again, when we talk about pipelines, how many pipelines will Mark Carney actually build if they're still talking about the same agenda the Liberals have been doing for the last 10 years?
Well, I mean, obviously Mark Carney knows more than the foremost experts on climate change on the planet, and I don't know how that is. I don't know how he's found the time to be the world's leading economic authority and also somehow know things about climate change and geography and all the rest of it that people in the IPCC, for example, don't know. Because even in the IPCC's worst case scenario, in other words, the thing that won't happen, but in their just in case part of their reports, they explain that the planet isn't going to burn. Even if it's like a 3 degrees increase in temperature, planet's not going to burn. That's nowhere is that explained or theorized by any serious person. So again, I mean, as I feel like every single time that we discuss climate change, I'm just going to say the same thing and hope that maybe somebody listens. Read the reports from the IPCC and then listen to people like Mark Carney and just have a think about why it is that he's exaggerating to such an extraordinary extent.
Yeah, so the Liberals under Mark Carney here are going to meet on Parliament Hill this afternoon, and likely we'll discuss an election maybe, and who will be in the cabinet. Because one of the things that we did see from Karina Gold and Chrystia Freeland is talking about how we all need to stick together and how they were going to invite Mark Carney to be his finance minister and all that. And were they campaigning actually for a job in his cabinet? Because he says he's going to have a smaller cabinet, so he says he's going to cut some people out. He said his cabinet will be smaller.
Well, I guess because he's such a giga brain that he can do most of the jobs by himself.
And Chrystia Freeland does not have a position right now. When she resigned, she does not have a cabinet position at this moment.
I would say with her that there's a pretty strong likelihood that she'll have she'll be given one or two jobs. One will be foreign minister, which kind of makes sense. If she's going to have any job, that sort of makes sense because she is very sort of internationalist, speaks lots of languages and so on. But if it's not that, I think she'll be given, ironically, what Trudeau was going to offer her when she resigned, which is like a kind of special file where she focuses on the U.S. trade relationship.
Yeah, Trump will love that one.
Yep.
And then Melanie Jolie has been seen shoulder to shoulder with Mark Carney at most of his events. So.
Yeah. Well, they're very good friends, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. And then Justin Trudeau and Mark Miller here. Mark Miller saying he's going to give illegal immigrants that work in the construction industry a temporary permit to help in home building in the Greater Toronto area.
Yeah, I saw some furious reactions to this from some people in the trades who are very, their position is that the job market isn't particularly good actually at the minute in construction, and so it's a little bit of a sort of blow to hear that illegal immigrants they're going to be competing with illegal immigrants now, as well as like a pretty tricky job market. They've also got this to contend with. So
yeah, the BC
but we'll see.
Ironworkers.
I mean, they're just the ones that made noise, so I don't know.
BC Ironworkers are ones that are making noise. The Ironworkers Local 97 calls for an immediate end to the temporary foreign worker program. They said that this is a way to undercut wages for everyday Canadians. And that story again from Hollydome Blacklocks. So is the other one. You can go to their website and you can subscribe, Blacklocks, and it's a great subscription to have. It's about $314 a year. Well worth the money.
We've actually got that one as well. That's Canadian Press at the Ironworkers Union. Yeah. So you can actually go on our website for that one. But that's a very interesting one because that's kind of like, that's a union that seems to have remembered what it is to be left wing. It's like, oh yeah, we're left wing. We're a union. We don't like unlimited immigration, which is like for the entire history of the left. That's basically been one of the top three principles. But for the last 30 years or so, for some reason that is very difficult to understand, left-wing parties decided that they absolutely loved mass immigration. It was the best thing ever, even though it's like transparently opposed to the aims of unions, which is like the unions are like at the heart of left-wing, like proper left-wing parties like the NDP and the Labour Party in the UK. So, obviously, if you look through any period of history other than the last weird blip of the last 30 years, left-wing parties and unions particularly were very, very hostile to immigration because they thought it was just like the monopoly man bringing in foreign workers who were cheaper to undercut their wages, which, it is. As Justin Trudeau said himself, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, no, I think that's been said down in the United States too. A lot of people saying that it's undercutting wages and making it tougher for workers to get a fair wage. And we're seeing that actually was our story that I was talking about. The other two stories, I think, prior to that were Holly Doan's. But Friedland says the Liberal race was an uphill battle. And Polyev says Carney, sneaky, former finance minister Chrystia Freeland, who came in second in the Liberal leadership race, said she knew it would be an uphill battle for her to defeat Mark Carney. Well, I mean, we all knew that. And we've put up the poly markets time and time again, showing that there really was no race at all. It was more of a what you call window dressing on a coronation.
Which is a little bit, in a way, since she seemed to know that, just like everybody else. It's not like she had access to some secret information that we didn't have access to, and that justified her campaign. She knew all along. So that makes me wonder, in that case, why didn't you step aside, Chrystia? Then, if she'd done that, then the Liberal Party would have been able to announce a leader in January.
Yeah.
And Parliament wouldn't have had to stay prorogued for 2 months. And Canada wouldn't, the Canadian political class wouldn't have had to be completely paralyzed by this farcical election that wasn't really an election.
Yeah, and I think that's what most people thought, that this whole thing was a farce, because there was the other two weren't even in the race, really. And they kicked out the only one that really, I think, could have caused any issues, Ruby Dalla, who's still being very vocal out there. But I think she was actually mounting a bit of, like a spoiler in there. But the other three weren't really in this race. And so it was a farce to buy time, I guess, and to just get the Liberals in the news a lot. Because look at all the airtime Mark Carney got in this last little while that he wouldn't have gotten if they didn't have this Liberal leadership race, right? Like he was on American TV, on English TV, and then, very, I guess, limited here in Canada. But, he's the one that everybody's talking about.
Yeah, and it's obviously benefited the party because, well, it seems like it's benefited the party based on the new polls. But like that could have been the idea. I mean, maybe the Liberals thought, okay, we got this chap who has zero political experience, like in terms of frontline politics, literally never done it before. He's always been like in the background, and he's obviously proved that he's not particularly good at talking, like sticking to his points. I think he could make some pretty stupid mistakes, like falsely referring to Canada as the primary exporter of semiconductors to the United States, for example, a mistake that you wouldn't expect an undergraduate economics student to make. So maybe they've thought, right, this is our very raw candidate. Maybe we should give him a dry run, a really, really easy, gentle little pat on the head with this farcical fake election. And then maybe after a couple of months of that, he'll be a lot more confident and a lot wiser and a lot better when it comes to going up against Polyev.
I think a fair statement would be this has been really good for the Liberal Party, not so great for Canadians and for Canada as a whole.
Yeah, well, I don't... I mean, the thing is, if you're a Canadian and a Liberal, then you would say, no, it's been great. It's been great in general. Everything's great. We're so united now. But yeah, people who aren't in the Liberal Party, looking in from the outside, will certainly say, like, this has just been like a massive sort of pageant. And it's just been a big party for the Liberals, really, hasn't it? It's like a confidence boosting exercise for the Liberal Party at the expense of the country.
And then Trudeau, on his way out the door, has done a lot more work probably in the last couple of weeks than he's done in his previous 10 years. He's calling for radical reform of the RCMP with less focus on frontline policing. Is that what he's trying to make them into the FBI or something, Homeland Security versus regular police work?
I mean, this is an exclusive interview with none other than the CBC. You'll be surprised to hear that Justin Trudeau decided to go to CBC for this. But in this interview, they don't mention that, but that was my interpretation of it. Yeah, they just want to make it into an FBI. Like they want to make it into sort of like serious federal crimes and national security, that kind of thing, cyber security. But I mean, the question will immediately be introduced, which is what are places like Cologne are going to do? You know, I mean, that's just one city, but I mean, vast amounts of cities in this and towns in this country rely on the RCMP to enforce
Especially
the law. So
northern
what's going to
communities,
happen?
all kinds, yeah.
Yeah. So what's going to happen there? Are they all going to have? Are you going to have like a tiny town of like 1,000 people have their own municipal police force? I mean, that would be a little bit.
Trudeau
That'd
has
be pretty
had
expensive.
a pretty good relationship with the RCMP, though, too. And then even a lot of journalists are complaining, not a lot, several journalists have complained, how did Mark Carney get RCMP detail when he was just a candidate? I mean, he like not a lot of candidates get RCMP detail, but he seemed to have an RCMP detail at his events.
A lot of these things seem to be done mysteriously behind closed doors, don't they? I mean, I remember when that fella accosted the RCMP, Chrystia Freeland's RCMP guard, accosted that guy from Rebel News who went up to ask her a question, which was in the news for like 2 weeks and then disappeared. I remember trying to get some sort of like explanation from the RCMP about that, and they are so reluctant to give you any information about anything. It's all just like a brick wall. They will not give you the information. So I don't think it's realistic to expect that there'll be anything forthcoming on this either.
And more bad news for Canada in regards to tariffs. Canada had put some tariffs on some Chinese products. They had put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, and that was and steel and aluminum, and that was to kind of like work along with Joe Biden, the Biden administration in the United States when they did those tariffs. And then here's China now slapping back. So not good for Canadian farmers because they're going to get nailed with 100% tariffs on canola oil, peas, and 25% tariffs on pork and aquatic products. So these Chinese levies are put in response to those tariffs that we put on them first. So when we talk about tariffs, it's not like Canada's not been doling it out themselves.
Yeah, but I mean, in this case, I'm sorry, but I just can't be bothered to give you a refined response to this. Any tariff China receives, it deserves. China is an absolute scoundrel in international trade. They deserve any possible punishment that you could conceive of in the world of trade. They deserve it because they are a menace to international trade. So, I mean, I'm not going to feel sorry for the Chinese. And obviously, they're completely unjustified in doing this on Canadian products anyway, based on how they behave in the international markets. I mean, that's just ridiculous. But in terms of like the political position, which is not usually that associated with reality, I would say it's a bit silly from China, I think. But this is what we've had this conversation before about China, where they're so arrogant and they're so bad at like the carrot. Let's say they're quite good at the stick side of things, but they're very bad at the carrot. They're very bad at actually like trying to seduce other countries to come into their orbit, even though they have a perfect opportunity here to to endear themselves to the Canadians, don't they? If you think about it, Canada's now furious with the US. China, the second biggest economy in the world, some say obviously the biggest economy in the world, a perfect opportunity for them to say, look, you've been betrayed by your big brother there, Canada, but we aren't bad guys. We're very responsible, sensible people, so we aren't going to tariff you on anything. We're going to be your best bud. And then a lot of Chinese people, a lot of Canadian people, I feel, would then think, oh yeah, China, all right, that's nice of you. But instead, they've blown this opportunity because it's just they're so sensitive and they're so arrogant and nationalistic, the Chinese government, that they just can't tolerate it. So they must slap back all the time. And this is how the Chinese will fail to make advances in the absence of the United States, I think, in the world. But obviously, it's also it's really unfortunate, isn't it, that we did this. We put the tariffs on steel, aluminium, and EVs out of China. We did that so that we could get a smile and a wink from the United States. We did it for them. We did it out of solidarity with the United States. And then the United States has betrayed us and stabbed us in the back with a spear. So, I mean, the reason we did this in the first place is now redundant because the Americans have completely shirked their responsibility.
And I think the big part of that was they're protecting the U.S. auto industry and the Canadian auto industry, because Chinese EVs are like, they're remarkably cheap, and they're starting to infiltrate all over the world, and Canada and the U.S. basically blocking them entrant into Canada and the U.S.
Yeah, but I mean, it was primarily done for them, wasn't it? It was primarily done for the Americans because that was one of the Biden administration's real bugbears, wasn't it? They were very hostile to Chinese car makers because they're kind of eating their lunch a bit.
And if you think about the auto giants in the U.S., they are a big lobby group. And you see that recently they're the ones that got those tariffs reduced, because it was the three big automakers that went to Trump and said, "Hey, you can't do this. This will really hurt our business." And it was off of their ask, and he even referred to it and said they asked. So I gave them 1 month grace period. So,
well, that's what Donald Trump said. I mean, whether that bears any relationship whatsoever with the truth is another question. I would never suspect Donald Trump of telling the truth. Put it that way.
I did hear it from Jim Farley, the CEO of Ford, saying that they're actively trying to stop it. So,
well, I bet that's been going on behind the scenes since the first time Trump announced these tariffs, way back before he was even inaugurated, because this will kill the American car industry. Trump's economic plan will destroy the North American car industry. I mean, it's like, in many ways, NAFTA was kind of like, it kind of was the car industry in so many ways. It was like, that was like one of the main reasons for it. That was the like exemplar. And it was not just of NAFTA and then later on the USMCA, but that was considered to be the best example pretty much anywhere in the world of an integrated industry across international borders. There's barely any, I mean, even in the European Union, places like that, there's barely any industry anywhere on the planet as integrated as the North American car making industry. So I would be astonished if behind the scenes these, like, the people in charge of Ford and GM and all the rest of it weren't like constantly screaming at Trump to say, please don't kill our industry.
And then moving to BC, the Conservatives kind of just blew up all over themselves here this past week, with Tara Armstrong being the third Kelowna MLA to quit the party on Friday.
Yeah, I mean, I wish, well, I don't know if I wish, but I can't say that this wasn't predictable because
there's a tweet, you can put that tweet up
many moons ago when we discussed this. We're not the only ones. We certainly predicted that this would be a difficult coalition to keep together.
And it all started with Dallas Brody. If you got that, yeah, Dallas Brody, where she was kicked out of the caucus, though, right?
Yep, she was kicked out of the caucus, and John Rustad said that it wasn't because she said that there have been no confirmed new graves at the Kamloops residential school. He said, because that was the controversial statement that she made. He said, it's not for that reason, because I agree with her. She's right on that. The reason is because she did a funny voice and mocked people that when people refer to their truths and that kind of thing. And he said that's why, because she was mocking, I can't remember how he phrased it, but like mocking people who'd been to residential schools. But, like as we said to each other earlier, he's in a really difficult spot, John Rustad, isn't he? Because he needs to keep two very, very disparate groups together. he needs to keep the kind of people who live in the Fraser Valley and all that, who are very metropolitan, very kind of urban. They don't care about stuff like this at all, and they don't think like that. They're basically liberals, you know. Then he's got to reconcile them with the kind of heartlands in the north and in the interior, and obviously, I mean, that's what destroyed Kevin Falcon, and it's, you know, funnily enough, it looks like it's going to destroy him too.
Yeah, and then Peace River North MLA Jordan Keeley announced that he's quitting in sympathy with Brody, and he plans to set up a new party. You know, there's still talk of the BC United coming back. These people don't seem like they would not align with the BC United. So, like, how many parties will British Columbia field? And this is all great news for Premier Eby and his NDP.
Yeah, well, it's definitely good news for them, because there are two left-wing parties in BC, and they're both best friends, the Greens and the NDP. So there's like, not only is there no discord within the NDP in particular that we're aware of, but there's also no discord on the left. They're best chums. They're getting along swimmingly. But this is to do with the human geography of British Columbia, I think, isn't it? Where you have like Metro Vancouver, which is just completely dominant in electoral terms in the province, and that's divided, you know, roughly, I don't know, 60-40 or something like that, or maybe 70-30, I don't know, but it's divided between two different kinds of liberal, like liberals who like left-wing economics and liberals who prefer conservative economics, which explains the BC Liberals and BC United. But then you also have this anomaly in terms of, compared to Metro Vancouver, which is the interior and the north. They are conservative on economics and conservative in social on social matters as well. And I guess it's like John Rustad thought that he could unite those two groups and win an election, and he very nearly did. But I mean, he's got to somehow keep them together. You know, that's a very big ask.
Yeah, somebody just asked, why did Tara quit? And she did put out her tweet there, and she says she doesn't do a lot of interviews. So she said that she left because the Conservatives promised to stand up for British Columbians and for what is right, no matter what the cost. But she said, under John Rustad's leadership, one compromise after another has transformed that party into something I no longer recognize. He's abandoned the truth and his moral compass in a quest for power, and the reality is he will end up with neither. No one's surprised when David Eby attacked Dallas Brody for telling her the truth about Kamloops, but John Rustad's cowardly decision to stab her in the back revealed just how corrupt he has become. You can find all this stuff on her X account. Like I said, Tara does not do a lot of interviews. We've asked several times for an interview. A lot of the MLAs in the Conservatives did not do interviews at that time.
Yeah, there was a lot of they said that they just needed to knock on doors, and that was more valuable for them. But there were other people that I interviewed who alleged that it was because they didn't know they couldn't survive. Basically, they couldn't survive under any sort of scrutiny, and they're worried that they'd say something silly.
Again,
so those were the two arguments.
This really plays into David Eby's hands. I mean, this is, you know, he couldn't ask for something better than this, you know, especially when he's starting to get challenged, you know, like, you know, Kelowna MLA Gavin Dew has been challenging quite well on things like the budget and that, but this really takes a lot of the energy out of that and focuses on, you know, what we see is a bit of a disarray in the Conservative newly elected, which they were challenging, and they were very tight. This definitely does not help.
I mean, incredibly so. Like 22 votes was the difference in one riding. If they'd won that riding, and sorry, if that had flipped, then they would have been the biggest party in the legislature.
And then again, another issue that has really hurt British Columbians in the interior for sure is that another BC Interior ER forced to close, this time for 2 whole days. And this time in Lillooet, which is, you know, next to Merritt. Merritt had those closures. They've had about 4 closures already in the last week of February. And we did speak with the Merritt mayor, and you can go listen to that interview on kelownanow.com, or you can find it on our YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, 2 days is a really, because often it's 12 hours. It's like overnight or something like that. But 2 days is a different kettle of fish, isn't it? That's like, that's pretty scary if you're in that neck of the woods, because they have to go to Kamloops, which is one highway, isn't it? It's one road, and I don't know. It's not ideal. It's also quite a distance. It's a good couple hours, I think, isn't it, to get there?
I mean, we've talked about this before in the the Merritt Mayor has said that they have accommodations set up in Merritt so that, like traveling nurses and doctors can stay in those locations. And maybe it's time that the BC government actually puts together a plan where it basically figures out a way to make sure that these ERs never close by rotating nurses and doctors through these more rural communities.
Yeah. The only question would be, would that be would that be too much for some of these like medical professionals who have all the power? And if it was too much, then I feel like and they threaten to leave and go somewhere else, and I feel like, you know, whatever health authority they work for would be forced to back down.
Yeah, I mean it's a really horrible situation, especially in the wintertime when, we have an emergency and if you're in Merritt or Lillooet and you're told to travel to Kamloops. Lillooet's quite a ways from Kamloops. I mean, Merritt's like an hour and a bit over the Coquihalla. Again, in the wintertime, terrible time to make it there. And Lillooet, that's a windy road to be, like trying to navigate in the winter. I mean, I don't know if anybody.
And it would be, I feel like it'd be quite hard to explain this to like somebody that doesn't understand BC, or they would look at it and they'd say, "But this is crazy! Like Lillooet, it's right next to it, on a map. It's like not that far away from the main urban part of BC. Like what? But the geography of BC is, with the mountains and everything, like it's pretty isolated, isn't it, Lillooet?
It's a tough slug, Lillooet, like to get in and out of there. I mean, played in some hockey terms. I coached hockey for a while, and you drive out to Lillooet. It's a tough slug. Like it's a windy road in the wintertime, makes it very challenging.
Yeah, and closures because of avalanches and crashes and things as well. It's like it's terrible, and you can imagine like a lot of people will be wondering. They'll be asking themselves the question, like, can I actually live here? Like, is it safe for me to live here? And for many reasons, probably not just health related, also related to like schools and things like that, because this is happening everywhere, isn't it? Like smaller towns and smaller cities, it's becoming harder to kind of maintain the gold standard, whatever that may be,
Yeah, and I think that
across a whole sort of country or a province.
I think, like there's been some ideas floated out there that immigration is something that's needed in Canada, but maybe try to put some of the people coming into the smaller communities and more rural areas as opposed to always the major metropolitan centers.
Yeah, I'd say that that's an absolute no-brainer, isn't it? I mean, and if you want to know anything about Canada, you should at least visit these places, but ideally, like, yeah, live somewhere else rather than just Toronto, which is kind of, or Vancouver, which are kind of not particularly similar, really, to the people that live around those cities. They're kind of their own beasts, aren't they?
Yeah, as a younger man, I think as a 19-year-old, I ventured into the north. I've lived in High Level. I've lived in Fort Vermilion, Fort St. John, Taylor, BC, Williams Lake, Prince George, Thompson, Manitoba. Now that's a nice warm place. Edmonton for 10 years when it was the City of Champions. Three Hills, Alberta. Moved around a lot. So there you go.
Yeah, Prince George. That's an interesting one. That seems to have a lot of opportunity to grow. That would be a good one to send immigrants to, because it's not exactly like it's not like a sort of one-horse town, is it? It's quite a big place, but it seems like it could grow.
It's probably the biggest city in the center here of British Columbia, basically right in the center of British Columbia, right? So it's the hub to the north. It's the hub to the north, the south, and to the west coast there, right?
Lots of nice wildlife all over the place as well.
Kelowna gets a lot of it's an attractive city to move to, as you can see in our live background here. And rents is one of the biggest problems. The rent or housing costs in Kelowna have been one of the biggest challenges that we've faced in Kelowna. But one of the things that the federal government has done well is that GST free rental buildings. They didn't charge a GST for builders to create these rent only kind of like rent buildings, and there's a lot of them, and they're all coming online around the same time. So we're now seeing incentives for people to move into rentals. They're signing a 12 or 14 month lease. They're getting up to 2 months free. And the vacancy rate, they say the vacancy rate officially is 3.8, the third highest in the country, tied with St. Catharines and St. John's at 4, and Calgary at 4.8. But the real vacancy rate in Kelowna, because I talked to a couple of developers, they said it's actually a lot higher than what the official rate is. And they're saying it's likely between 5 and 6%. Even the city of Kelowna kind of agrees with that the real rate is between 5 and 6%. And with that said, the incentives is the first lure, because nobody really wants to lower the rents, because the people that did rent then get upset because they paid, higher than what new people are getting the rent because they're locked into their lease. So they use the incentives first, and then as time moves on, you're probably likely to see some downward pressure in rentals. And that's good news for people renting.
Yeah, it's what the people asked for, isn't it? So it's like one of those rare occasions where people actually got what they asked for.
Yeah. And one of our regular readers on here, Brett, says that it's an hour from Merritt to Kamloops, but it's 2 hours from Lillooet. Again, 2 hours can mean everything in an emergency, right? And whether that's a logging accident or what have you, or even a car accident and stuff like that, right? Or even heart issues. That's a huge difference. And this is what was really guts our smaller towns, because if you're a senior, when you need access to emergency care, you're going to choose a larger center now because it's tougher and tougher to get hospital care.
Yeah, somewhere like Kelowna with a big hospital right there.
Yep. And you put this one in, so I'm going to let you talk about it. Support becoming a member of the European Union.
I just find this pretty funny, really. It's a bit mad as far as I'm concerned. But a few people have mentioned this, and then The Economist magazine did an article on it, and I think that was like a stamp of approval for people to start talking about it more seriously, which is this idea of Canada joining the European Union. And according to Abacus, a polling company, they seem to think that, based on their sample of 1,500 people or whatever it was, that 46% of representative Canadians, so they then extrapolate and claim that actually represents 46% of all Canadians, would support the idea of joining the European Union, while only 29% would oppose it. But I don't know. And the BBC also, we should add, not just The Economist, the BBC also did a little piece on it where they were saying that it might actually not be as crazy as you think, kind of thing. But I still happen to think it's quite crazy myself. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I think like that the UK exiting just a while ago, you'd have to wonder why you would want to join, and they seem to have more problems than even Canada has in their economy. And the other thing is that maybe with Mark Carney, the self-proclaimed global elitist, he said that himself, he would like to, because he identified, when asked at a summit there, he says he identifies as European, so I'm sure he would likely be all in on this, and maybe this is kind of, these polls are setting us up for it.
Well, one of the most controversial things that he did as Bank of England governor was he was accused, and I think with some justification, he was accused of trying to tip the scales in favor of the European Union during the actual referendum, where he came out a couple of times and said, this would be disaster, in so many words, I'm paraphrasing here. He said this would be disastrous for the British economy, and he really had a lot of bad things to say about the idea of leaving the European Union. So that was one of his most controversial actions as governor. But no, in general though, it's just a bit of a funny one, I think. I feel like the Europeans would really love this idea, because so many Europeans would love to be able to escape Europe and come move to Canada.
Exactly.
But they would also love it for the resources, obviously, which they lack.
Yeah, exactly the point. Like, if you think Canada's got some issues with their economy, you need to look to Europe. I mean, it's quite the mess over there, like literally.
And they have social problems. Like, it would be very hard for a Canadian to even wrap their head around the kind of social problems they have there, because they're so extreme.
Like you said, I'm sure many Europeans would welcome it, because, and I think this may well be the trump card that works, because we could threaten Donald Trump and say, you know what, we can join the European Union. And I am sure that the Americans would not like the European Union parked on its doorstep.
No, I mean, they would hate that.
That would be the ultimate trump card. And you just said, okay, so if you don't want to be our friends, we'll go friends with them. And then that would That would, I think that's the best trump card of all. Never mind tariffs on energy and all that stuff. Just say, at least treat us like a friend. Make the North American Union really strong, economic union, like what we had, the USMCA. Make that stronger. Or you're going to have the European Union at your doorstep. And, like open borders, really, right? That's the biggest thing of the European Union, which many say that it's definitely caused a lot of pain, and a lot of the European countries are actually trying to close their borders and send foreigners out right now.
Yeah, the Germans have done that there because they have something called the Schengen Agreement, which is, you basically, anybody that's been to Europe, I guess, would know this already, but you can just cross the borders from like France to Germany, for example, without any checks or anything like that.
Well, there is no border. There is no border.
It's just like a highway, and then you're in.
Yeah.
But the Germans have started to institute checks again because they're freaking out a bit. Although they did that in the build up to the federal election in Germany, and a few other countries also do that because obviously they've had a pretty crazy experience with immigration over the last. Well, I was going to say 10 years, but really it's more than 10. But particularly the last 10 years since the migrant crisis in 2015, it's been very, very difficult. It's been a really touchy subject for the Europeans. And obviously that would infuriate, like you say, that would infuriate the Americans because then they would effectively, because Europe's obviously connected to Asia, so it kind of has a land border with Asia and all of these countries that produce refugees like Syria. And Afghanistan and all the rest of it, like they often walk, they walk through Turkey. That was how they did it. Yeah. Or they get on these little dinghies and go across the Mediterranean Sea. So in effect, like they often say, Europe's border now is with the Middle East, basically. That's like a border that Europe has. But if Canada joined the EU, then Americans would freak out because they would see it as then America has a border with the Middle East because they would be able to get to Canada.
I would caution Canadians that this will likely be one of the biggest ideas that Mark Carney pushes, and he'll use the fear tactics of Trump being, how we need to partner up with the European Union. This is going to be the best case ever. And I would just ask you to go and read a lot of European news before you jump all in on that.
Yeah, but then the Americans, they're not being conciliatory, are they? Like at the prospect of losing Canada, so to speak. I don't think they're aware of the enormity, to use that word in its true sense, the enormity of this situation and how tragic this could be for the United States. I mean, you've got Elon Musk, for example, which we didn't include in here. It wasn't going to be a topic that we were going to discuss, but you've got Elon Musk now openly saying that the United States should leave NATO, which is just like, that's an astonishing thing to say, an absolutely demented thing to say, in my opinion, but I mean, a very extreme position to take. So rather than trying to be conciliatory towards Canada, they're going in the other direction. They're like digging an even deeper hole.
Yeah, and just on the European Union and NATO and NORAD, I put a thing up on my LinkedIn on the weekend here on NORAD. With Chrystia Freeland talking about tanks coming and getting nuclear weapons to fight the Americans. They have to realize that Canada has no protection in the North without the Americans. Like, we have an aging fleet of CF-18s that are, I think we have 85 supposedly, and I think maybe 65 of them are operational. We have a very small Navy, and we have no nuclear icebreakers, no nuclear warships. So Justin Trudeau was supposed to buy F-35s back when he first got elected in 2015. He said they were too expensive, and then he refuses to buy those F-35s. He's going to find a cheaper alternative. And only a couple of years ago, I think it was just 2023, that he finally ordered some F-35s, which are going to take almost forever to get delivered. In the north, there is the Raptors, the American Raptors, the 50-plus Raptors, which is the highest tech fighters in the world. And then they do have a fleet of F-35s up there, plus nuclear subs and nuclear warships. So our north is protected by the Americans. So before we want to light that relationship on fire, we need to find something that where Trump will listen to common sense and not cut off his own nose, because they're very much becoming isolationists, which is not a good place for the America to be either.
No, I think it does almost seem like they're going to have to learn that the hard way, though. The people who are kind of have this almost religious faith in Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. I feel like they're going to have to learn all over again why it was that the Americans sought out global hegemony in the first place. They did it to protect themselves. They did it to make themselves more prosperous, and it worked.
Yeah, but again,
they did it because they were scared. They didn't want the world to be unfavorable to the United States, basically. So they went to Japan, and they went to Europe, and they blocked off Soviet expansion, and they tried to put a lid on Chinese expansion as well. They did all these things for themselves, but obviously that was 80 years ago, and now they've forgotten why they did that, I think, and they're going to have to learn again. If China had the sense and the wisdom to become a global hegemon, I'm not sure it does, but if that did happen, the Americans would not prosper in that situation. They would lose out in a big way.
I would just advise Canadians go have a look at what NORAD is and what our contribution to it is and what the American contribution is, and recognize that we share the largest border with Russia, and don't forget, whenever we're screaming to escalate the war in Ukraine, that we're right next door to Russia.
And they have many, many more people than us, full stop, but also many, many more people in the north as well. We basically, the Canadian North is essentially unpopulated to all intents and purposes.
They have military bases up there. They actually have a big oil port up there too for exporting oil and gas, and again, nuclear icebreakers and nuclear warships as well, nuclear subs. Again, if you go look at the Canadians, the current Canadian military situation is dire, and that's the Liberals have done that. So we have less than 55,000 troops. Less 55,000. I think we have like 2 frigates and like maybe 65 operational old planes, 40-year-old planes, F-15, 40 years old, right?
Yeah. And if America's not there to back us up, because I've just gone onto the YouTube there, somebody's asking, like, do you think Russia's going to do a Normandy-style landing in northern Canada, which I imagine is tongue-in-cheek, that question. I think that's a cheeky question. I'd say nobody predicts that that's going to happen, but if America is no longer looking after us and no longer giving us their protection, then imagine a scenario where a country like Russia or China landed somewhere in Canada that's like basically uninhabited, like Victoria Island or something, part of Baffin Island, and then just set up a camp and started to drill for a mineral or something, just as an example. How could Canada resist that? What would we do? If they did that and then they said, if you kill these soldiers and these workers, we'll drop a nuclear bomb on Toronto or something. Like, what the hell would we do in that situation? We would be completely on our knees and hopeless. We would have no possible, we couldn't just go and send a battalion, if we even have a battalion, to go up there and fight them, could we?
And then Jean Chrétien actually made this part of his speech last night too, and he said that because even the Americans have challenged the North, and they said that it's international waters up there, and Canada's always challenged that it isn't international waters because there's ice and land and different things, right? So it's hard to tell where the land is, where the ice is, and all that stuff. So that has been a controversial topic up there. And there was an American ship up there going through the passage, and I guess you're supposed to put the Canadian flag on when you go through, and they weren't. So Jean Chrétien went out there to meet him. I think it was not when he was prime minister, but one of the ministers, and made them put the flag on. So, I mean, it is already a controversial area, right? And that's why Greenland is so important to the Americans too, is because it's the military reasoning for Greenland being important, and as is the Canadian North. And if we do get the Northern Passage opened up, it will be the most economic passageway in the world, bigger than the Suez and bigger than the Panama Canal.
Yeah, and not to mention the minerals and oil and all the rest of it that's up there. I would say something about Chrétien, though, which is, I mean, he was in power in a completely different era, completely different time in the world's history, but it was particularly a very different America then. You could do stuff like that with America back then. You could almost you could stand up to them and shame them almost into sticking to their own principles, and they would probably do it, or a lot of the times they would, Like the Vietnam War, for example, they were basically shamed into getting out of there. Yeah. Whereas with Donald Trump, and if this is the new kind of America, there's a big question there. Is this just a blip, or is this like a new path for America? But with this new arrangement, America's not like that anymore. They don't care. They don't like if you try and shame them or you try and pull off a stunt like that, they just don't care. Because now it's like, okay, you look after yourself then. We'll just leave NATO, or we'll just like put 25% tariffs on your exports. Like, and in that scenario, it doesn't matter who you are. Jean Chrétien, Justin Trudeau, Mark Carney, whatever. It does not matter who you are in charge of Canada. You don't have any cards to play then. If America turns predator, we don't have any cards. We don't have anything.
With that said, let's move on to markets. Gold continuing to chop in this zone here. I think it's just right now, just under the $2,900 mark US dollars. Bitcoin dropped. Actually, I'm showing 80,000 on here, but it's actually right now at this moment just below the 79. Looks like it wants to fill that gap. We talked about it. Either it's going to go higher or it's going to fill that gap. It looks like it wants to fill that gap. So there you go. And that gap is down in that 70,000 range. That's when Donald Trump was elected. So then it shot up right after that. And then so there you go. Canadian dollar. You thought you would have got a little bit of a bounce there with Mark Carney being elected, but Canadian dollar not reacting really at all. If anything, just a slight downward movement in the Canadian dollar. Again, what I think...
There's uncertainty. There's an election to be had, isn't there? So it's like nobody knows where to go.
If you want to see a strong bounce in the Canadian dollar, we need to elect a prime minister with a strong mandate for Canada's natural resources, and that has a clear path towards getting our #1 exports to market. And it's all about energy. It's all about energy.
As so much of economics is, really.
Yeah. And then in our AI and tech, OpenAI to charge $20,000 a month for PhD level agents. Some people are going to say that is ridiculous, $20,000 a month. But if you think about it, like some of the people, like software engineers, make way more than that. And they're saying these agents can do the work of PhD level research. And
I presume that is because it's so expensive to run the hardware, which again is energy, isn't it?
And the thing is that people are going to really have to realize this. And energy is, money is money, right? But money is just an exchange to get more of a product. And most of the products all really come down to is energy, right? So the real commodity out there is energy. And Canada happens to be sitting on vast amounts of energy. And even the North, that if we could open up the Northwest Passage, even with nuclear icebreakers and stuff like that, if we could open it up even through, without climate change, but just through technology, that would be the most important passageway in the world for trade. Think about it in the, like we were talking about, the Suez Canal. That one can get blocked really easy if ship goes sideways. I remember the blockages that happen. The Panama Canal takes forever to get through because you got to lift the locks. It's a big process to move ships through there. Sometimes they
and then
wait.
You have to. They can close it as well theoretically. The Egyptians, or they can increase the price hugely and make it uneconomical.
If you go look at a map, there's maps with these RFID tags, and you can see some of the ships sit there for months waiting to get through the passage, right? Because it's still shorter than having to go all the way around South America. The Canadian passageway would be the shortest passageway for trade for the east to the west, the shortest by far, and no locks needed.
Yeah, and also, providing the ice is at bay, it would be a very safe route as well, because you're not likely to encounter pirates or anything up there.
No, there's not a lot. And then, somebody's putting on here that Trump's going for nuclear energy. Yeah, nuclear energy is going to be part of the solution going forward. But again, Canada has some of the largest uranium deposits in the world. That's why Alberta and Saskatchewan are the crown jewels of Canada. They're literally the crown jewels. And I would say that, British Columbia could be that, but under this current government, we've really suppressed our natural resources and in favor of other technologies. That and I did an article on that on LinkedIn as well, talking about our superstars are benched while we're putting up our future stars that are should be playing in the minor leagues. I think they could turn into superstars at one point, solar and wind and all that stuff. But right now they're minor league players compared to nuclear, LNG, and oil and gas.
Yeah, and then hydro, obviously, which is a real superstar player. But I think hydro is hydro is something that BC has in abundance, obviously, and I feel like it's almost like what they call a resource curse. If I don't know if you're familiar with that term in economics, where it's like you're so blessed with a resource that you end up screwing it up, and your economy ends up not being as big as it should be. I almost feel like there's maybe a bit of that in BC because hydro is so reliable and it's just such an amazing form of energy, and BC is so blessed with it. I wonder if it's kind of they've become complacent.
It takes forever to get something approved, and then it takes forever to get it ever built too, right? So that's the problem with hydroelectric, right? Once it's up and running, it's kind of keeps on giving, but like it's a long, like if you look at our Site C dam, how long it took, how much over budget, and the environmental stuff, and that because it does flood a lot of land too, right? So, and you have a lot of
that's the most controversial thing.
You'll have a bunch of special interest groups because there'll be some like chipmunk that'll get drowned out and stuff like that. So, so it's very tough.
A Lillooet chipmunk.
It's very tough. I remember even like small company here in Kelowna, just that they were doing some drilling, and they had to do an environmental assessment, and turned out that there was a bird nesting nearby, so they had to spend, I think it was like $20,000 to muffle the sounds of drilling a hole, so that it didn't disrupt this bird that was living in a nest.
Most favored bird. Meanwhile, the Chinese are just like they just get the steamroller out and just build it in 3 weeks or something and drive like 50 species to extinction. Yeah, I mean, I'm being facetious there, but you have to remember that like those are our rivals, the likes of China, our civilizational rivals. And if your rivals are doing things like that, it's not necessarily always going to be a great idea to shoot yourself in the foot, is it?
There's no doubt about it. Capital is fleeing Canada, and even David Eby said that. And he says it's just happened since Trump, but it's been happening for years now. And including Mark Carney himself has taken his company out of Canada to the United States of America. And in our tech world too, Romania moves to suspend TikTok as election investigation begins. And there's talk even, this was, I put out one of the people in the political world saying that the Liberals have a group there that want to ban X in Canada. I mean, just think about that. Banning X in Canada, already you have basically Meta banned in Canada, like for news, right? And then these countries that don't want freedom of speech are talking about banning social platforms. Well, they fund, like in Canada, wants to double the funding for CBC.
It doesn't. When you put the pieces together on that jigsaw puzzle, it doesn't make a pretty picture, does it?
Nope. No, and then independent media outlets like ours getting choked off and crippled. We're going to see 3 more fold here on the Lower Mainland in the next little while. They've said May is their last days of operation. Bill C-18 is have the traffic and have the revenues of media outlets across Canada. And so that really makes it tough for independent media outlets or any media outlets. Go look at the stock charts for Chorus, which is global. Go look at it for Glacier, Post Media. They all look like abysmal. And then, so does the Canadian Liberals care? And then they're going to double the funding for the CBC. So if that's what, Canadians, that's what you feel comfortable with, is just having one media outlet in Canada and then cutting off social media, then hey, then it'll be, that's what you get.
It's very sad. And then also we talk about Romania here. They just today, I think it was today, they announced that they've banned the guy that won the first round of the election, but that that when it was annulled.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he literally won an election. They do it in rounds there, I think. So he won the first round, and then they annulled that. The court just said no because he's received money from Russia or something like that, and there's been social media campaigns that have been possibly out of country in origin that promoted his candidacy. And then he appealed all that, and then now they've said no, he can't run. He's the front runner again in the sort of rerun, and then they said no, he's banned. He can't be a candidate. So it's kind of if you give your establishment that much power, where they can ban social media, then they can even annul election results and say no, you're far right, like you're sponsored by bad people. We're just going to annul this election.
Does that sound familiar to you? Did something like that just recently happen in Canada?
Well, the thing is, I don't think we're quite there, but I mean...
Did Ruby Dalla get accused of of election interference with taking money from the wrong places and then getting what? Literally banned.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the sort of like the philosophical and intellectual groundwork has been laid in countries like Canada for something like that to happen. I'm not saying that it's ready yet, but we do seem to be trending towards that of like the idea of the exception and the emergency, like meaning that you have to suspend the normal way of doing things. Now, obviously, we saw that during COVID as well, but and then climate change is another one of those things where it's kind of like in ordinary circumstances we would never do this. However, and then then they point to the emergency.
So let me just put this to you though. Ruby Dalla was banned, kicked out of the race because it said she took money or she received money from the wrong places. If that's the case, though, then the money should just be refunded to those people, like, given back. But it shouldn't have affected Ruby Dalla's campaign because she wasn't the one giving the money. Like, she wasn't going out and getting the money. Like, I think a deeper investigation has to happen into why Ruby Dalla was kicked out of the election cycle. Because are you punishing her because of what other people did? And the same thing, this thing in Romania. Did he go get the money from, like they're saying these things, but not really providing much proof of it, right? And these people are fairly popular as well.
But then, as usual, like it's like a straw man argument in a way as well, because these people are usually a bit wacky. I mean, like Ruby Dalla, obviously, she wasn't your run-of-the-mill politician or your run-of-the-mill liberal politician. They obviously thought that she was a freak within the Liberal Party, and they sort of had like almost like an animalistic repulsion towards her, I think, and they just thought like she is not a liberal. Like, no way do we want this person embarrassing us, kind of thing. So they get a test case like that, so to speak, and they say, look at this awful person, and then they say that's why we have to suspend her. But what really matters, and I'm not saying Ruby Dalla's an awful person, obviously, I'm saying that they say that, but what really matters is the principle. But so often the principle is buried, and it's like they just get what they see as a bad example, and they say, look at this bad example. But then all along the principle, which is free and fair and open elections in this case, that just gets buried away. Another example is obviously freedom of speech, where it's like, oh, look at this guy who like says all this racist stuff or like denies the Holocaust or whatever. Like, therefore, we have to suspend free speech and we have to like prevent people from being able to speak their mind. It's kind of the principle is what matters, not the example like you've summoned up to try and limit speech. And I just feel like so often that the principle is neglected and it's not even discussed as being important.
Yeah, the Liberal Party used to be the party of democracy and the party that I really aligned with, and then not so much. Like this Ruby Dalla thing, I think should really be investigated. It should really be taken a look at and seeing what happened there, because I think it needs a few rocks to be flipped over for sure.
And the other guy, don't forget, Chandra.
Yeah. And let's move on to our EV section here. And in the United States, all these tax on Tesla dealerships is now, I guess there's been talk that some of this money is being traced back to Act Blue and stuff like that. We're going to play this clip here.
Oh my gosh, a Tesla Cybertruck is on fire. All right, there's a fleet of Cybertrucks right now. Unbelievable. Seattle fire on the scene.
That's good.
Breaking.
So there you go. And then they're saying that that this is being funded by Democrat NGOs. So, and it seems like people watching the news, even in Canada, people are starting to react. Because I had a friend here, we did it on Tesla Talks, and she was kind of like she was sitting in her car in Tim Hortons lineup, and somebody started screaming at her and running up to her car, and she's like, she rolled down the window, thought maybe something was wrong with her car, and he started screaming at her and saying like, how dare she be driving a Tesla, she needs to sell it and all this stuff, and she's like, what's going on? And these people are really unhinged. I thought the climate change was the most important thing.
But it's just the politicization of all things, isn't it? Once again. I mean, Elon Musk is in the news. He's like probably the most prominent supporter of Donald Trump, and therefore, he's kind of out there, so people target his products. But there are lots of people that support, to varying degrees of enthusiasm, Donald Trump, including like, the guy that owns Facebook and
Yeah.
WhatsApp and Instagram. These people all obviously use Instagram. They probably post videos of themselves on Facebook going up to bully somebody with a Tesla. It's like you have to be consistent.
No, one target at a time, because you can't attack too many things at once, right? I think that's part of the thing, right? Like, because if you really want to be like all against Trump, there's a lot of things. Like, if you look at the list of people that donated to his inauguration, that would be Ford and Toyota and Zuckerberg and
Bezos.
Bezos and Apple now. Tim Cook just invested big time. So then like the people screaming about buy Canadian, don't buy American. Like screaming at people. Then take that phone out of your pocket and let's get smashing, because that's an Apple product, or likely, or a Samsung product, right?
Yeah, and ChatGPT as well. So you're going to exclude yourself from AI, pretty much.
Google is just so much, Anyway, we got something more positive here. We're going to run this other clip here. There's no sound on that. Anyway, that's Tesla semis are starting to roll off the assembly line there in, I think it's Nevada. And then the energy business. Tesla's really an energy business, and that's one of the biggest things too. And it's just energy. Again, the point is, it all comes down to energy. Energy, energy, energy. And what does Canada have? A lot of energy. What have you had 10 years of? Suppression of energy.
And I think that's being recognized now by the Liberal Party chief. Like the first group of people I would list there, because they're constantly talking about pipelines and things now, even though
but
for the last 10 years they haven't been too favorable to them.
If you look at that speech last night, the first thing he mentions is like Pierre Poilievre's going to let the world burn down, which is Pierre Poilievre says he's going to get the natural resources going. And then he says, so obviously his must be different. And if you go on his platform, and he's going to talk about climate change in there. And most of the banks have left Mark Carney's, which he chaired, the Net Zero Alliance, because the banks were cutting off the funding for oil and gas companies and that. And most of them have now left it, all the Canadian banks and many of the US banks, and even the Japanese bank just recently left this Net Zero Alliance. On Mark Carney's platform, he says there that he will mandate the banks back into this. So there you go. They love a good word. Mandate, existential, those are good words. Can't use them enough. Can't use them enough in a sentence, right?
Well, Justin Trudeau used the word existential, didn't he, in his speech? It is one of the favorite words, I think.
He had his speech last night. We'll just talk about that for a couple of seconds. And he had his Kleenex there, and he talked about all the great work he's done, and I think he stuck that Kleenex in his eye so he could get more tears coming out of it. He didn't consider all the tears from many of the Canadians have lost their businesses, and how many families have lost loved ones to fentanyl crisis, and how many people can't afford a home and all that. There's a lot of tears that have been shed.
Yeah.
Not a lot of.
He also said something I found a little bit strange, because he contradicted himself, as he's done a number of times. I mean, all politicians do this, to be fair, but it was quite an interesting one, because it was a bit jarring, I thought, because he said something about like what makes Canadians Canadian, and then he said it's not by defining ourselves by who we are not. And then he went on to talk about Canadian values. But I was like, just a couple of months ago, he was in the US on TV repeatedly saying to different people that the number one thing that Canadians identify themselves by or with is not being American. So he just like directly contradicted himself. And then he also said something about how a country is like more than a flag and a territory or something like that. It's like, this is the guy that said that Canada was post-national, that it didn't have a national identity. It's just quite a lot of contradictions in Mr. Trudeau's speeches, I find.
Well, there you go. We're just going to leave off with the meme, the funny thing, and this is the only meme that we could find today. Laid off IRS agents get new job checking receipts at Costco exit. They were gonna arm the IRS agents. Like, just think of that in Canada if they armed our CRA agents.
Yeah, they should arm the receipt checkers at Costco as well.
Yeah. Um, I've heard a lot of different reasons why they actually check the receipts at Costco, but any idea?
Is it so that people don't crash into each other, so that they leave in an orderly fashion?
Yeah, it might be a good positive, eh? Instead of running out the door. Well, I think they want to make sure people actually paid for that cart of groceries for one thing, right? It's just a good way to keep honest people honest, right? And another one is to keep,
Yeah, I thought we were taking that for granted, that was that's the rationale.
and the other one is like to stop collusion with staff members too, because Costco has, it doesn't take much to get about a couple $1,000 in a cart at Costco, right? A couple pieces of meat, actually, right? Couple of
Yeah.
those chunks of like a whatever steak, those bigger pieces of meat where you got to cut it yourself. A couple $100 for that, right?
Yeah. Well, that is the kind of that's the average receipt at Costco must be like $400 or something, mustn't it?
Oh
Like
yeah, does it?
they must rake in huge sums.
He can basically line the bottom of your cart at Costco for $500.
Yeah. So I suppose in that sense, the receipt checking kind of is logical, isn't it? Because we're talking about huge sums of money, like lots of expenditure for them. But then they also do it at like sometimes anyway, they do it at Walmart and places like that. It's like, come on, dude.
Yeah, no, yeah, you got your people at the gate. I mean, there's a lot of theft has been a big problem in the United States, especially, and it's happened some in Canada, especially in the bigger centers, right, in Toronto and stuff like that too, where people just go into stores, smash and grab, and do things like that, right? So
Yeah, well, it's usually because the laws have been changed to make it so it's essentially not a crime under a certain value, like $1,000 or what have you, and then the police just won't investigate. This is happening in the UK as well as US, Canada. I don't know about other parts of Europe, but I'm sure that's also happening there. This idea that you shouldn't prosecute crimes that aren't serious, like that's been taken as obvious by a lot of people in the sort of elite for a long time. But it turns out that it's not so obvious, because when people think that they can commit
get away with
crimes
it.
and get away with it, they do it more often.
Yeah, especially organized crime. They see the loophole and then they exploit it. Makes sense, right? The same thing as the car thefts in Toronto there just a while ago when they were advising people to leave their keys at the police were advising people to leave their keys at the front door. So someone broke into your house to get the keys to your car, that they wouldn't have to go through your whole house. They would just be right there ready for you. Well, you might just leave it running then in the front yard, right? But you couldn't do that because there's a bylaw that says you're not allowed to leave your car running. And again, Jon Stewart made fun of Chrystia Freeland on that, on her interview with Jon Stewart, and talking about this climate change, these policies were nutso. And she laughed and agreed with him, and that it was just, like that was Trudeau. And she said, and even this person that keeps commenting on TikTok, she said herself that Justin Trudeau spent 10 years virtue signaling and identity politics instead of dealing with the Canadian economy. And that there, D1, is right straight from Chrystia Freeland's mouth herself, the Deputy Prime Minister. And if you look at the stats on Canada, the Canada GDP per capita, and you match that up against the Americans where we used to be higher than them, those are facts that you can't run away from. And that's what's been going on here in Canada. And that's straight from the mouth of Chrystia Freeland. I can send you the link to that if you need it.
And she's hardly the only one. I mean, my favorite example of a person that likes to badmouth liberal policies is Justin Trudeau. He's probably the best at doing it. Just listen to his speeches where he just lays into his own policies on housing and on immigration and so on.
Especially when
Very
he's lecturing.
articulate and just.
Especially when he's overseas lecturing other nations on how to have a democracy. And people are just like, what are you talking about, right? Anyway.
Yeah, and he likes to talk about bringing in all the voices and listening to your opponents rather than just attacking them and things like that. It's like, I don't know. The thing is, he's been the most powerful person in Canada for 10 years. This just happens. It doesn't matter if he's a liberal. It doesn't matter what he is. What matters more than anything is he's powerful and has been powerful for ages. So as a consequence, he's racked up all these bills, and lots of people are running around with receipts trying to get him to pay for them. It's just kind of inevitable. And the same was true of Stephen Harper. It does happen after you've been in power a while.
If you go play Justin Trudeau's speech that he made in 2015 when he was running for the election and then match it up to today, in that speech he said Canada is broken. And the same Liberals now say, how dare you say Canada is broken? That was basically Justin Trudeau's speech in 2015, that Canada was broken. And it'd be easy to make the argument that Canada is more broken today than it was, according to Justin Trudeau, broken in 2015. And then they ran on accountability and transparency. And you can't tell me there's been accountability and transparency. I would say there's been a lot of abuse of power and privilege.
Yep. Well, that's why Parliament's prorogued, really, isn't it? Because there was a potential spending scandal that the Conservatives didn't want to budge on. They wanted to try and expose something. They thought that there was something there, and the Liberals didn't want to release it. So instead, they prorogued Parliament. So, it has real effects.
Yeah. Again, those are out of the mouths of Chrystia Freeland herself, and that's out of the mouth of Justin Trudeau himself. It's not me making that up. That's them saying those words themselves. And that's all we have for today, though. You've been watching Kelowna Now. We ask you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our X and our TikTok and all that. And we are still banned because of the Liberal government's policy on Bill C-18, the only Western free world that can't put news on a social media outlet. And then now they're advertising on that outlet themselves. They're spending over $1 million advertising their policies and that on Meta because they said they can't get news on the platform, all because of their own Bill C-18 platform. Or bill, sorry.
Indeed.
There you go. Thank you for watching Kelowna Now.
We don't just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent. News you